Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Women Get on Board Virtual Speaker Series and fireside chat, Courage in the Boardroom. We're just going to give everyone a quick minute to get in and get settled. And while you're coming into the room, we have a few tech tips for you. Please make sure to turn your cameras off and your mute on for the duration of the event. A note that this session will be recorded, and the recording will be shared in a follow-up communication along with a feedback survey after the event. Please feel free to use the chat function at any time to ask a question to be answered during the Q&A period. Now I'd like to turn it over to Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get on Board. Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha, and welcome, everyone. I want to begin our Women Get on Board Speaker Series virtual event today by acknowledging the land in which I live is in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. The Upper Canada Treaties cover this territory. It is with the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, the Wampum Agreement, and is directly adjacent to the Haldimand Treaty territory. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to enjoy the natural surroundings of this territory. I encourage all of us to become actively involved in understanding why land acknowledgements are so important and understanding Indigenous histories and contemporary Indigenous issues in Canada. I also want to take a moment to reflect on the current conflict in Ukraine, which is causing humanitarian crisis with far-reaching implications. We stand together to support our community with family and friends who have been deeply impacted. So good afternoon and good morning to some. I am Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get on Board. Women Get on Board is a social purpose company. We are member-based, and our mandate and our mission is to connect, promote, and empower women to corporate boards. We have over 800 members across Canada with diversity in our Women Get on Board membership, and our goal is quite simply to get more women on boards. Women Get on Board is delighted to be hosting this virtual event speaker series with our sponsor, and thank you to Director Prep. Our topic today is courage in the boardroom. I will spend the next 45 minutes having a fireside chat with Scott Baldwin, co-founder of Director Prep. I'll introduce Scott shortly, and then we will have a Q&A, and then I'll do a thank you and a follow-up closing remarks, and we will have you on your way by 1 p.m. So our topic, as Keisha indicated, is courage in the boardroom. And it is my pleasure today to introduce Scott Baldwin. He is the co-founder of DirectorPrep.com and the publisher of the Sunday Morning Savvy Director blog. And if you're not a subscriber to that blog, I encourage you every Sunday morning. It's my first read, Scott. I enjoy your Sunday morning blogs, as you know. I usually comment. We usually have a chat first thing Sunday morning. So Scott Baldwin is an entrepreneur, certified board director, and co-founder of DirectorPrep.com, a for-profit social purpose company featuring an online resource hub to support directors, preparing them for their board role to contribute, collaborate, and influence decisions. Scott's diverse board experience has given him insight into different industries by serving on private and not-for-profit companies. He leads transformational change, and new venture creation have been common threads throughout his career. Scott has served over 10 years as the Manitoba chapter executive for the Institute of Corporate Directors, 4 years of which he was the chair. He's very attuned to opportunities, sees the big picture, and will ask some of the practical questions, or maybe some of the courageous questions that some may not ask, and a great way to kick off board discussion. Scott currently serves as the vice chair of the Manitoba Arts Council and is on the Finance and Audit Committee and its Investment Committee. Scott has served as an external member of the Dr. Manitoba's Governance and Human Resource Committee for over 7 years. So Scott, let's get started on our conversation. Welcome, delighted to have you. Just by setting the stage, I will be interviewing Scott today. So Scott, that is your role. I'll be interviewing you. You're not interviewing me. We just had a little side chat about that before, because last week Scott interviewed me for an ICD Manitoba chapter event. So Scott, let's start by defining what courage means from a governance perspective.
Thank you, Deborah, and pleasure to be here with your audience, and thank you for the invitation. I think in the most fundamental way, my answer, the short answer, and I'll expand on it, is you would not be surprised that it's doing the right thing for the right reasons. I think that's, in a nutshell, that's really what courage in the boardroom is all about. When we often use the words governance courage, I think we're referring to a director speaking up about something they feel is right, despite their fear. And I think that fear is a key word into this description. And that fear could relate to a decision, a discussion, a process, a person. And we think about what might cause a director to be afraid. And there are any number of things, the fear of being wrong, the fear of looking stupid, the fear of, that's me, the fear of harming relationships, the fear of being ostracized, the fear of not fitting in, the fear of negative outcomes, or even just the fear of making people angry. It really fits in a lot of ways. And we're all quite familiar, I think, with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's definition of, the fear. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But there was something else I came across recently that I think really helps in this discussion as well. And he said, this is, again, FDR, and I'm reading here, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. So you may be feeling hesitant and fearful to ask that important question that needs to be asked. And often that's the best way to get around this, is to ask just a good question, as opposed to sticking your neck out there a little bit. But you got to get beyond it. And that's a big part of what governance courage is about. And so it's just come back to doing the right thing for the right reasons.
So Scott, you noted someone very famous in the definition of fearless. As I was preparing for the session, I would like to reference a quote from Ernest Hemingway. Courage is grace under pressure.
I like that.
And so when you think about courage, you need to have confidence to step up with courage, but you can be graceful in your courage approach. And I think that kind of speaks to, and I know we'll probably get into the conversation about emotional intelligence, because courage is a very big element of having emotional intelligence in the boardroom. So maybe before we go to the next question, Scott, is there anything from most recent, an example of courage that you might have undertaken or stepped up? I didn't script that question for you, but I was just thinking that's kind of the definition of courage. But can you give an example of you being a courageous director? What courage did you take to lean in and ask the questions?
Yeah, I really shouldn't share things with you beforehand. I'm going to share. I will share something. I'm going to be really careful on how I do it. And this is as recent as last night, and I'm still a little shaky. I'll be honest with you, like in terms of having to get this way. But here's the situation. So I've been involved with an organization for well over a decade, and external member on their committee, and it's a professional association. So think lawyers, accountants, that type of thing. And directors on this board, it's a large board, they're paid an honorarium, a pretty significant honorarium. Members are quite comfortable doing that, for their board meeting. It costs about $30,000 to run a board meeting there, in a professional association. Anyway, so that's how it goes. It's cultural, it's longstanding. There's no argument there. And that's fine. It's just the way it's been. But, they've been working, and part of the discussion last night, working on some other types of member engagement or things that they could do, and looking at various options. And part of that was, a large town hall type of event or town hall forum. But it became clear to me that option was going to be set aside because it was going to cost almost $150,000 to do it. And I'm thinking to myself, look, my question that I wanted to ask was, why does everyone have to get paid? Like, seriously, this is members' money, what is it? And so you think about that, because again, it's very cultural and within that. So we're going to get into this a little bit today about how you can have courage in the boardroom through asking a good question. And I did have a few moments to put one of my acronyms to good work, WAIT, why am I talking? Just to step back and think about my question a little bit. And I did come up with this type of approach to the group. Would this option be more viable if the costs weren't so high? So as opposed to saying, why does everybody have to get paid? Kind of pulled it back, and it led to a discussion, and it went from there. And for me, that I didn't think of it at the time, from a courage perspective, it just was the right question to ask at that time from someone who is independent and could actually have that view. And I think it did trigger, I don't know where it's going to land, but because it was very clear to me that they wanted to hold this event and it was important to hold this event, but they weren't going to do it because of a sacred cow, And so just asking a good question to challenge that, I think, took some courage.
So just to that point, not to deliberate too long on it, and thank you for being courageous to share it with us today. It's pretty hot off the press for you. But do you think the framing of that question made all the difference? Like you said, you could have said, hey, you could have said, hey, well, why don't we not get paid for this? And instead of solving the problem for him, you framed it in a way that it was a broader question to open that up, that dialogue.
I think it certainly did. It framed it from the perspective of my question being more palatable to that audience, but more important, it was better for me. I felt more comfortable asking the question in that way, knowing that it wasn't as confrontational. And we got to the point, and we got to where we needed to go. So that's a little bit of that.
But yeah, it's that courage, just knowing when to ask, what's the right question. And I really think that comes to the broader having emotional intelligence, to know the audience, to know the kind of responses and coming in being objective, right? As a director, we have a fiduciary duty from an oversight perspective to act in the best interests of the organization, the stakeholder. And so when you step back and it's not for you personally, does that empower you more to have courage?
I think so. And I think it ties into one of your questions later. It's, it can help to alleviate your fear when you do remember that it is your fiduciary duty. It's your job, that's what you're supposed to do. It's no different than this. I found this really helpful. I mean, Deborah, you make a lot of public presentations, and do you still get nervous before you make them? A little bit, the butterflies, got to get them to fly in formation a little bit.
Yes and no. I kind of think that if you're prepared, as that's the most important thing. Just taking a big breath before you go in, taking a big breath. But
well, someone once said to me, and this helped me a lot, and it was like, well, so like, what is my fear all about? Well, again, to the list of fear of looking dumb, being stupid, not doing a good job. But when you turn that and say, no, I'm going up to that podium to serve this audience. I have information that is going to benefit them, and similar to asking that tough question or that challenging question in the boardroom, you're asking it in a respectful way, but you're there to serve that board. You're there to serve that stakeholder group. That is your fiduciary duty, to do the right thing for the right reasons in the best interest of the corporation.
Well said, Scott. So let's move on to the next question we have. Do you talk about an aha moment in your guide to governance courage, which everyone will get a copy of, a link to post this session? Can you describe what that aha moment is? If there is one?
Sure. And, I think this is what we meant in the article. And the Savvy Director Guides are where we take a number of our blogs and condense them down into a PDF that you can use in a boardroom situation or to talk about a certain topic. So please, I hope encourage you to give this a read. But what we mean by this aha moment is that your fear in the boardroom is what it is. Don't try to talk yourself out of it. Instead, start learning and practicing how to deal with it. The fear or flight response is there. And I apologize, that phone should be muted. The fear or flight response is hardwired into our lizard brains, regardless of the source of the fear, psychological or physical. And it's not an imagined threat, it's real. And so when someone says to you, like, okay, you're scared of spiders, just saying something, don't be scared of spiders, they won't hurt you. That doesn't help. It just doesn't help. So the aha moment is acknowledging it and recognizing it. And it is what it is. Now we got to work around it and get beyond it.
Do you think that that aha moment, you might be in a boardroom and you're watching, you're observing, you're seeing behaviors, discussions. Has there ever been a time where you go, I'm not going to ask that question right here now, but I am going to follow up with the chair of the board or another colleague? Can you talk about that element? Because I don't want people to know that everything has to take place in the boardroom meeting. Yeah. Do you want to, have you ever had a moment where that needs to be discussed, but not right here and now?
You make a fabulous point, because especially if it's a challenging type of thing that might embarrass someone, or you call them out on something, you're saying to, I need to make this point, but maybe not right here. And, we talk about being on a success path from being an early stage director to being recognized as a savvy director someday. Well, you're well on your way to becoming a savvy director when you have that finesse to realize, I'm going to go offline with this. This is something I can talk to the chair about, or I might want to talk to the CEO offline, while avoiding, the parking lot discussion. It's not to do it so that you don't have that important discussion that should be held at the board, in the boardroom, but maybe it's a setup, or I think, Deborah, you probably recognize this, where you might contact the chair ahead of the meeting on a certain contentious item, or maybe there's a piece of information that's missing, but it's a question you want to ask. But by doing it ahead of time or doing it offline, you might get your concerns taken care of without having to take up board time or put people in a difficult or awkward situation. So if that's what you're alluding to, I think that's certainly something that I've seen and something that we've all done or tried to remember.
Yeah, no, and I liked you talked about the progression from, sort of a emerging, aspiring, just new on a board member to more the progression of where you get, and that comes in time. So maybe we'll turn to the next question, Scott. Okay. Can you tell us about the 3 types of courage defined by Bill Treasurer in his article, Courage is the Key to Great Leadership? And you reference governance courage. What do you mean? And can you give examples?
Sure. Now, Bill Treasurer wrote this article, as you referenced, and often when we write our material for the Savvy Director blog and the guides, we will take content intended for a different purpose and bring it into the boardroom situation because we see the lateral benefit of doing that. And that's exactly what he was talking about, leadership. And Deborah, as we had a conversation last week on knowing your value in the boardroom, leadership is a big part of that, along with influence and knowledge. But in this article, he had these 3 pieces of what he called types of courage, which he called the ability to try, to trust, and to tell. And briefly, what he was getting at, so in try, that's really the courage of initiative and action. That it's mostly about perhaps external facing courage, like a new venture, a new partnership, financial risks, or courage in a crisis. And for example, boards and management teams all through the pandemic over the last 2 years have had to put this kind of courage to work when facing tough decisions that may have had to have been made, during COVID and that type of thing. So that's try. And then his second one was trust. And that was about the courage to have confidence in others, that it's about letting go of the need to control situations, having faith in those you may have delegated to, and simply being open. So in a boardroom context, it's about learning to trust, which in itself, it's a positive in terms of board dynamics. So Deborah, in that boardroom situation as a board, which player in that scenario do we need to demonstrate trust the most? It's the CEO. Right? In all those things. So you are, as a board director, showing that and expressing that confidence in the CEO that they have the capability to make those right decisions. And more often than not, we need to cede to them because they're in the business every day and certainly know a lot more about it than we do. So though that was in Bill Treasurer's article, you talked about try, trust, and then perhaps the one that has most relevance to us and the Savvy Director Guide on Courage in the Boardroom was about tell. The courage of voice, For a director, that's the essence of governance courage. First two, they're important, of course, but this is what we're doing in the boardroom as directors, doing the right thing for the right reasons. Sometimes directors just simply need to be reminded of that from time to time. Another one of our blogs that we wrote was "You're braver than you think," and it sort of links to that. So, by example, Intel and the courage of voice, it's about speaking up. It could be about disagreeing with others, sticking to your guns, having that integrity that brought you into the room in the first place, and doing the right thing for the right reasons.
I like, so it's 3 T's: try, trust, and tell.
Certainly. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So, if I just reflect on the tell part of courage in the boardroom, if I may, I have a blog that I wrote. It was about finding your voice in the boardroom. And it was very much about speaking up when, you might not think it was the right time, but having that voice to speak up and the courage to do it. Because we all, again, back to our fiduciary duty, you can't default to silence and let your other board members speak. You are there for a reason. You are contributing. You have value to bring to a board, and there's a purpose. There's the broader purpose of the organization. And so if you're serving the best interests of the stakeholders, then you really should have that courage to speak up. And, and I have an example, which is very, very straightforward, was I had been overlooked to join a nominating corporate governance committee. And I thought it was quite clear to my other directors that I should be on that committee. And I realized in the middle of the meeting that I better speak up or forever hold your peace. So I just put my hand up and I said, hey, I'm not sure if you're aware, but I really would like to join this committee. And they're like, oh, we didn't even know that.
Right.
So I didn't let that chance go by. But sometimes it's overlooked. Sometimes if you don't tell, if you don't speak up. So I just use that as a very practical example of something that had happened to me. Is there any ones that you've been overlooked, or things that you thought, oh, I better speak up now or forever hold my voice?
Well, I think I probably do. And I can think of more of the ones where I didn't speak up and regretted it, as opposed to your courage in speaking up. And often that'll be like, didn't they know I was interested in that? Didn't they know I'm good at that? Like, why? And it's very simply a matter of they just weren't aware, and so, kudos to you and, for doing that. And did you get on the committee?
Of course I did. But Scott, I probably have more that I didn't speak up than I did speak up. Okay. And I have stories about that too. So, but I think part of having these conversations and having these speaker series is to empower our members, to empower very much like how you are, contributing and, informing those savvy directors. Very much our community, our women members are trying to say to them, have the courage, empower yourself. And you're not going to know everything, and it's part of that progression. So anyway, thanks for sharing those 3 types of courage from Bill Treasurer, and more details in your guide. So can you talk about what is your gut telling you when you're a board director? What does this mean? And can you give examples? Like when your gut, deep down, your gut saying, I better speak up, or something doesn't feel right. Can you talk to that? Like where does courage come in?
I think in this part of the guide, we were referencing an article from Jane Mack, and it's part of what we do. Alice Sayont in our office, co-founder of Director Prep, has a tremendous skill in synthesizing resources from different places so that we can curate this information for you, so to make better, faster, easier, save you time as a director. Now, what Jane Mack was getting at were essentially Quaker principles about, trusting that gut feeling that something is out of balance or off center. She's referring to the tensions that are always present in the boardroom, tensions that really have a lot more to do with board dynamics and those relationships, more so than the facts and figures, perhaps. So there are a number of examples of being off balance where things might just feel a little off kilter. And that's what your gut is telling you. Something's a little off here. People aren't clear on their roles. Directors aren't respecting the boundary between board and management. Maybe the board isn't functioning well, or people aren't feeling free to express their views. Discussions getting off track, decisions are not getting adequate attention. The board is groupthink, for example. The board is not serving the organization well, a board member not pulling their weight. Again, things are just a little off kilter. You've got something a little off here. Maybe I need to ask a clarifying question. Maybe the situation where the CEO is running the board. Decisions are being made by the executive committee instead of the full board. Maybe the in-camera sessions are nothing but directors complaining. If that's the case, your gut is telling you there's something not quite right here, And so that's what really we meant when we synthesize and pull this together by, what is your gut telling you? And might suggest that with governance courage, you can step up, speak up, and ask questions that need to be asked. Because as directors, avoiding conflict is generally something that we strive for, right? It's, sometimes we just want to keep our mouths shut to keep the peace. We don't want to be the one who rocks the boat or is, naming that elephant in the room. But sometimes, if no one else is doing it and it needs to be done, it's going to come down to you. And then then you're talking about the how, and how are you going to ask that question? And interestingly enough, in our advisory practice, the business that led to the building of director prep, those are often the situations that we got called in to deal with, and unfortunately, sometimes those relationships were beyond repair and somebody got fired. You got to be dealing with it ahead of time to allow those dynamics to flourish and not get to situations where perhaps a good intervention question from a director could have led to a discussion that cleared the air a little bit. And, because your gut was telling you something was not quite right.
Do you have a memorable gut feeling story that you could share that, just in your own gut, it didn't feel right, whether you spoke up or whether you didn't speak up?
Well, I think the example I gave earlier, as recently as last night, that was a gut, that was completely gut. And I picked it up in my pre-work, in my prep. I read the organization does a tremendous job with their materials going in, and I read, I think, this doesn't feel right to me. It seems like they want to do the right thing, but because of cost, they're not going to do it. And I think money is just money. If they weren't going to do this event because it was going to, divide the organization or create, there's a bunch of other reasons not to do it. Let's talk about that. But if it's just money, there's ways to figure that out. And that was what my gut was telling me. And I just had to, screw up the courage to, when the timing was right. And I did, wait for that opportunity and think ahead of time. We're trying to avoid scenario where you're just blurting out, what your initial reaction is. Take some of that time, to be careful about it. And I think I just saw a question pop up about if something isn't quite right, but you can't quickly or fully articulate it, pause, take the time, wait for your moment. Maybe it's in camera. Maybe it's something you're wanting to avoid coming back to agenda items that have passed, right? I mean, nobody wants to be that director, but work with your board chair and try to get the attention so that you can ask that question that needs to be asked.
Yeah, and if I just kind of reflect, not that I have all the experiences, but collectively over the years, one of my gut experiences where I had became the chair of a not-for-profit, and it was a long-standing relationship that the previous chair had with the founder and CEO, and they were a little too close, and changes weren't being made. And finally, I was appointed chair of that not-for-profit, and it became very clear that we had to make a decision as a board to replace the founder and CEO. And the gut was saying everything, but I had to put due process in place to ensure that we, covered it, a governance process. But I can tell you that took so much courage. I had such backlash for the predecessor, but it was the right thing for the organization to do. And I can tell you, as chair of the board, it was pretty lonely at the top because, you had to go through this process, but it prevailed that the organization is thriving now. It was the right thing to do, but it was that gut feeling that this isn't right, that I've been called to serve. I've been called to chair. It was that broader context in which my role was that gave me the courage to lead on that initiative. So
was that many years ago?
Yes, it was pretty early in my career, my board career. Yeah.
So were you like the only woman on the board?
I was only woman chair.
Yeah.
I think, I wouldn't say no, because I think there might have been 2 or 3 other women.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think actually there was a lot of empathy. I got a lot of support. There was the emotional cue to it. And I think I got the emotion, I got the support from the full board. They knew it was the right thing to do. So anyway, I just put that in, like, it was just the gut telling, but it was the courage to do it. It would have been easier not to do it because everything was status quo, but it was time to move. It was time for that founder CEO to move on. So
don't you notice in those situations that once you've asked that question, and sometimes it opens the floodgates, because there's 6 other people around the table who have the same question but didn't have the guts to
and it
ask
wasn't
the
an
question?
overnight. As you know, Scott, as a director, you don't make the decisions individually. You're making decisions collectively. So we had to go through a 360, like we put due process in, and it all came back, but we had to have the evidence base. We had to do the governance process. And at the end of the day, it was very liberating because it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't a gut check, do it right now. It was put the process, and governance is all about process. So let's move to the next question.
Sure.
In her article, Courage in the Boardroom, Natalie Richardson has 6 tips for being courageous on the board. Can you speak to these 6 tips and give any examples where appropriate?
Okay. Let's go right here are the 6 tips off the bat, and then I'll circle back and see. So here are the 6 tips. Be clear about why you're speaking out. Be concise. Say your point directly and constructively. Let's stick to the facts. Maintain your composure and stay on message. Okay, sounds fairly straightforward. Easier said than done, I'll suggest. So let's come back to this. Let's be first tip was be clear on why you're speaking out. And we alluded to this, touched on this a little bit earlier. Courage comes from knowing why you're doing this in your job as a director and fulfilling your fiduciary duty, which we touched on a little bit earlier. Seeking a better outcome for the organization and the stakeholders. And with that in mind, you're coming from a place of strength. So while you are dealing with fear, it is your fiduciary duty. And that, I do believe, helps calm the nerves. Just the same thing as, getting up at that podium to speak. It's to serve others, not to be too worried about your own, how you come off. So it's why it's doing your job. I think that is just helpful. So sometimes just reminding yourself that that's my job as a director. I need to ask this question to put things in perspective and helps take care of some of the personal reactions around defensiveness, denial, anger, that type of thing. So that was number 1, about being clear why you're speaking out. Number 2, and I'll combine that with number 3, be concise and say your point directly and constructively. The board meetings are short. There isn't a lot of time. You really can't go on and on and on. You need to get and make your point and be concise, to get there. And what happens sometimes, happens to me, it almost happened last night. When you're nervous, you just naturally want to delay and you put in additional details, maybe like I'm a little long-winded with this answer. It's just because you're going and you just want to, justify sometimes. You ever heard a sportscaster ask a question where this used to kill me? I used to come out on news radio years ago, and our broadcaster they'd hold the microphone up to the athlete and they were just yada, 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 justifying why they were asking the question as opposed to just getting to it. And I think that's being concise and saying your point directly and constructively is something that Natalie Richardson talked about a lot. And sometimes when you're dealing with a confrontation or someone who might be disagreeing with you, it's, people want you to get to the point, but at the same time, you might want to say something like, I respect what's been said, but I disagree, and here's why. Very tight, right? It's like, I guess hear your word point, but I do disagree, and here's my reason why. 4th reason, stick to the facts. If you dwell on how you feel, you're going to get emotional. And that's something that, I've dealt with, and it's something you just got to be careful of, because if you get overly emotional, you do lose credibility. People may feel empathy towards you, but also uncomfortable and want to get the whole thing over with. So that's another reason to be brief. It helps you to stick to the facts. So we've gone through 1 to 4 and into number 5 and 6 together. Maintain your composure and stay on message. If others become aggressive towards you, The idea is not to respond in kind, just stick to your point. And if the initial point is rejected or glossed over, return to your message. You might try saying something like, hey, thanks for that. Maybe we can deal with that another time. But right now I'd like to return to where we were at to try and stay on point. So I think those were the 6 points that Natalie was referring to and that we captured in the article. And that's what she was getting at.
Yeah, and I think it was just a reinforcement as I gave you that definition of courage is grace under pressure. That's your composure, right?
Yeah,
that's your
absolutely.
composure. And knowing, I mean, we all can be emotional and passionate, but the other one I would say too, when you sort of are rambling, don't qualify. Don't say, hey, you know, is it okay if is it okay because I'm thinking this? It's just get to that point. And I think a lot of times people have to ask, they feel like they have to ask for permission, which already will undermine what you're going to bring, right, to the table.
And if you're a new director on the board, I think you can only go to the well so often with, well, I'm new here.
You know? That's why you have board buddies, right, Scott?
That's right.
Yeah. So anyway, so we've got one last question before we turn it over to our audience for Q&A. So Scott, if you've been around boardrooms, you've spoken about this board effectiveness, savvy directors, you know, what are the key takeaways you would hope that the attendees today will, you know, remember from this session, Courage in the Boardroom?
Well, I hope that they're all positive in message and encouraging in the sense that speaking up on difficult issues in the boardroom, it does require governance courage. And the courage to ask the right question at the right time is really one of the most valued traits in an effective board director. Everyone can be courageous. It can be learned. It's a teachable and learnable skill. And when speaking up on difficult issues, be calm, concise, stay on message. And I think you said it very well, grace under pressure. And if there's one more takeaway I might add, again, it's coming back to it's your fiduciary duty to put the organization's best interests before anything else. It's your job to speak out, whether you're on a volunteer nonprofit board or a paid corporate board or a private company board. It's all about asking those questions that need to be asked. It's your fiduciary duty. It's your job. And keep in mind always that sometimes asking those questions, it lends toward the due diligence that might need to be done on a specific issue, which if captured in the minutes, I mean, that can actually be the question that saves you from some negative repercussion down the road.
So Scott, I kind of wanted to incorporate this some way, somehow, and I thought about it, and I think it's probably a good way to segue into the Q&A. So great takeaways. And I do see that as positive. I see that as these are tools, these are tips, these are insights to think about. You have a fiduciary, you're at the boardroom table, and you have the right to be asking the questions, the courage to step up. But I just recently finished reading Hella Bank-Jorgensen's book, Stewards of the Future. And it was funny, when I read a book, I always go to Scott's got his, we've all got ours, bring them to the summit, get them signed. She's our keynote speaker. As I opened the book and the forward, Kimberly's reading it too. So phenomenal book, but I opened the forward and it says, for board members everywhere with competence, confidence, and courage to be stewards of the future. And it's interesting that Hella used courage as one of the attributes to step forward to be a steward of the future. And I wanted to reiterate that because I was, we'd planned this session for quite some time, and I opened the book and I was just smiling because to have the courage, to have the confidence and the competence, but that courage, you can't have competence and confidence without courage, and you can't have courage without confidence and competence. So anyway, so I know you'll have more to share. Oh, the name of the book is Stewards of the Future. And if you type that in, right, there you go, Scott. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Hella will appreciate our promotion for her book. A really great book. So let's start with the questions that we have, Scott. Okay. And hopefully we have time to read them all. I think I just lost them. Here we go. Let me find those for you. Okay, so So from one of the attendees, I love the idea of being there to serve as you present to a group. So I guess that was more just reiterating. I really like, Scott, that you and Kimberly was saying the same. It's really that whole concept of serving. So anything else you'd like to add? Because I think that really set the stage when, you're stepping up and you have courage in the boardroom, is to remember that you're there to serve.
One thing that comes to mind for me as you asked the question was linking to purpose. And, you are there to serve. And it's, I think the challenge becomes, how do we remind ourselves of that in the heat of the moment? It should be, I think, it'd be a challenge for anyone. But this whole notion that you are there to serve, that's why you need to do your prep. That's why you need to come to the meeting ready to go and to participate. It's important. And I think I don't know if I have much else to really add to that, except in that execution of service, that does include sometimes asking the challenging question. If we just might touch on that a little bit, courage, I think, has helped a lot by being able to make your point in the form of a question, as opposed to blurting out, I think that's dumb, or that's stupid, or the things that would cause the hackles to go up, or I do disagree with that, and here's why, and maybe follow up with a statement. But what is the question you want to ask to get greater clarity toward the point that you're looking to make? It just seems to be a safer way to go sometimes, especially when you're when you're getting over fear, and the more you do it, it builds momentum. You've done it once, you can do it again. You do it a third time, you just start to get that much more. You recognize the fear welling up inside of you, but I've done this before. How am I going to handle this? And it does build momentum for future situations.
Well, great advice. So I think Anna's, maybe not a question, but comment, but I think it's great to kind of frame it up as Anna's basically saying, knowing that others have the same internal dialogue, oh, do I speak up or not, helps understand that we are not alone in this. So she's thanking you. And I think that is really pivotal. Know that you're not alone thinking those thoughts, sort of like, so I think that was just a comment just saying, hey, if you realize that you have fear, but you're not the only one that's thinking that, right? And I think you tie it back to your purpose to serve, but the purpose of the overall organization, what their purpose is to and why they exist. I think those are big fundamentals, but they ground you.
I think that's more helpful, realizing that others might be feeling the same way. And as we've often said, there are no stupid questions, and there could be other people around the table that have the same question. I will clarify, I came across something recently I thought was quite insightful. They said, well, to that cliche, there are no stupid questions. Well, if the question was answered in the board material and you didn't read it, that's a stupid question. And everybody's going to know it. But recognizing. So
how would you respond to that, Scott? How would you, if that came up, you wouldn't say a stupid question. How would you deal with that, director, at that time?
If you were the chair, for example?
Yeah.
Or whoever, I think I just say, well, Steve, thanks for asking the question. It is in the material, and answer it. You got to call them out. I mean, and you do it in a nice way. Everybody else knows it. If you just let it go and let it slide, the rest, I think you lose credibility as a chair.
Yeah, I think pointing out, well, it was on page 18 under executive comp or whichever, and you move on, right? You don't gloss over it. I just wanted to see what your response was. Sure. So good. I think you answered Deborah's comment, because I think you saw it as, what is your gut is telling you something isn't right, but you can't quickly fully articulate the question. And I think, Scott, is there anything else? I think you answered that through in the session, but is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think I would reinforce the point that you made, Deborah, because I think that was even a much stronger answer, that sometimes you need to think about it. You can't deal with it right away. So take it offline, and maybe the one reason you can't deal with it right away is because it's a little too sensitive, or you want to think it through a little bit more, or decide who you want to talk to, or sometimes talking to another director. Do you feel, am I off base on that? Just kind of compare and see, and just again, to give yourself additional confidence to pursue the matter.
That's a good tip there. So we've got a question from Catherine. Catherine's experience as the board chair can play an important role in encouraging dissenting views. We are trying to bring diversity to the board discussions, diversity of opinion. We need to create an environment to have a safe space or place in the boardroom to pay attention and discuss these dissenting views. So Can you speak to that, encouraging those dissenting views?
I think, I don't know, it's the Catherine I'm thinking of. She's very involved with the ICD and teaching their chairs course. And the point being, and the importance of the role of the chair to really set that table and make sure that you are asking the questions that can get people to open up. I'm not sure what the best question would be around beyond, are there any alternative views on this? Or especially, we've written a lot about groupthink. And if you're jumping and you're getting somewhere really, really quickly, and as a chair, you might be realizing, or even as another director, like, oh, hang on a second here. What are we missing? Is there an alternative view on this? Like even that example I gave earlier, in an organization where everyone gets paid a pretty healthy honorarium to do something, and it's just an expectation. Therefore, we can't do that event. Well, it was in my mind, well, why not? Why? Like, why does it have to be this way? Why do we always do it that way? Can the chair play a role in, if they're not getting the dissenting question or the alternative question, is there a role? I'll put this to you, Deborah. Is there a role for the chair to play to actually ask that question, whether they are, I'll say sincerely interested in it or not, but just to ensure that the discussion is robust enough to ensure that we've considered all views.
Yeah, and I think there's, as we know, our good friend Brian Hayward, his book, The Great Chair, another great reference to, got to pull that out. It's knowing the dynamics around the boardroom table. And actually, if people are silent, saying, hey, Scott, I noticed you have nothing to say. Is there something you'd like to add? Almost sometimes people don't take their silence as that they have nothing to add. They just may not have the courage. And so maybe you have to encourage them to have the courage.
That's a great point. And I think once that other person who does have the courage, then on that encouragement, ask that question, just watch the other people around the table who may have a follow-up or they've been thinking something similar, and you've given them permission, to step up if they were a little hesitant themselves and they say, okay, I can add value to that. Here's my question. I have the same concern. And bring into that. And I heard an example of that the other day of someone who was in a board meeting, and it looked like it was a CEO succession issue and they're going down a certain road. And someone just said, hey, have we got the right process here? And all of a sudden it just opened up a conversation, because other people were thinking the same thing, but for whatever reason, no one was raising it. Well,
and again, going back to governance is about process, right? It's a process that companies put in place to make decisions, and that's governance at its best. So we have some more questions, Scott, if you will allow continued time here. We're still good for time.
Just keep bluffing here. Here we go.
You're doing a great job, Scott. I love your authenticity. A question from Patrice. Thinking of the recent Rogers board situation that ended up playing out in court based on what was publicly shared, if appropriate for you to opine, what lessons can be learned from that kind of situation? And are there any similar examples you can share that we can learn from? So I guess looking at the Rogers scenario, the drama played out in the courtrooms and the boardroom, is there any lessons from that particular situation that you can bring back from, tying it back to the topic, courage in the boardroom?
There are a number, and sorry, I just keep making reference, but we wrote about that at the time in the blog. And if you go on to it's all in the archives. I interviewed a very savvy director in my community who serves on Canada's largest agribusiness board, big 7th generation family business. And this fella, he's so knowledgeable in these dynamics in a family business situation. So when we wrote the blog, I went to interview him and get him some perspective. And he had a view that never came out in the media as far as I saw. And that was the damage to the family that comes out of that Rogers situation. And it'll get glossed over and they'll say they've made amends. It will never be the same. And that's just a real key point. Now, we weren't in the room. We don't know if the earlier independent directors, raised the right questions. I read somewhere that maybe they had, and it was just ignored, and the chair had enough power and authority legally to do what he wanted to do. And if you could say that those questions were at least asked and you can, look in the mirror and I did my job, well, then the decision was made, but at least and the due diligence took place. So that's a tough one. But again, just the damage inside to that family, which is such an important piece to the fabric of your community in Toronto and Ontario and all around, and the foundation work and everything that they do. And I'm contrasting that to this family that I'm aware of here, where it's so tight knit. And so, it's like, it's a real cost to that situation, is the permanent damage that has likely occurred to the dynamic within that family by perhaps, I can't say if the right questions were not asked, but that's an assumption.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was so much played out, and they had opposing corporate governance advisors on both sides, one for the family, one for the company. It boiled down to governance, good governance, what was good, what wasn't, the leak, et cetera, et cetera. So it certainly was a drama. They likened it to the show that was out, Succession, but
Sure.
the Canadian version of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure, other examples. So when it's family controlled and you've got that dual class structure, that's what created some of those tensions. And just recently, Shopify, I'm not sure if you were reading and viewing, they are proposing a different kind of governance structure where there's a sunset clause. And then we're not here to be experts, Scott, on that,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
that has other implications.
Well, I've actually heard that, going back to the Rogers conversation and who I was talking to, there was some suggestion of that you could put something in place with a sunset clause so that when the family is no longer there or they've moved on, that it reverts back to a more traditional way. Now, Deborah, you have a lot of venture capital experience and you're early with boards and stuff. Were there dual class structures back then? And I'm getting off topic.
I was pretty vanilla common share structures, really. And then it would just be, what series you came in from. An investor, was it, Series A? So there might be preferred shares depending
Mm-hmm.
on the shareholder arrangement, but there really wasn't that because it wasn't family controlled, because it was investors that were coming in and taking more. There was dilution going on. So
right. And by contrast, if you're Elon Musk, you could just buy the whole thing and take it private.
And that will be a session. I'll look forward to that blog when Savvy Director does that. I'm just going to check to see if there's any other questions, because these are lots of good weigh in and discussion. Got a question in from Barbara. So once you've made your point and tried, if you haven't succeeded in influencing the board, how do you gracefully conclude?
Boy, that's a fantastic question. I'm going to defer to you a little bit here in a minute, because I don't know if I have a great answer to that. If you've asked that question and it's going absolutely nowhere and you feel like you've asked it in the right way, you do need to move on, especially if another director chimes in or to others and say, no, I think, we're okay there. We've done our diligence. At least, you can feel like you asked the question and that was important, but you're part of a team. And you're part of a group that is making these decisions. And if you are in the minority on that, I think in most cases, you need to accept the fact that you've been outvoted, or that's not the consensus view, and carry on. And if it's something that is pivotal or fundamental to your happiness and success on that board or ability to carry on, then you need to think about resigning.
Well, that's my experience. And I love that you said gracefully conclude. So Barbara, mine was a graceful conclusion of my exit to the board, because we were trying to do a CEO succession, and it was from the moment, it was a 3-year long tail horizon, and it never happened. And so when I was standing for re-election, I just said, that is my conclusion. I can't influence the board anymore. This is not happening. What do I need to do for myself? So I made a graceful exit at that time, because again, no matter what I did and tried to influence, it just wasn't going to influence. So I think there's a point in time, not that everybody's going to make a graceful exit, but I think there's a point in time in how much you influence and how long the period of time is. It's not a one and done board meeting, but for me in that particular case, it was years in the making, and finally it just wasn't happening. And so do you stay and be optimistic and hopeful? Sometimes history repeats itself, right? And it didn't. So I did make a graceful exit at that time. So
there you go. as my mentor said to me, sometimes it's not how you got there, it's how you leave.
Graceful, if you can, always. Annie, thank you for commenting. We were referring to Hella Bank-Jorgensen's book. Hella, through her Competent Boards, has some amazing certification programs. We send out to our members in our affiliate partner programs, we reference Hella Bank-Jorgensen's certification programs, and our members get a discount. So Annie, thanks for that reminder. Phenomenal program. Scott knows I've just finished it. So now I have my GCB.D. I know Annie, you do, and I know there's several of you on the call today that have it. A phenomenal program. And if you are really leaning in from an ESG perspective, I just think for any board member, it is just a really current governance program to consider. And then if you really want to specialize, there's ones that are just specifically a program on climate change. Scott, I don't know if you want to comment.
Yeah, let's not forget that at the inaugural Women Get On Board Summit in May, Hella Bank-Jorgensen is your keynote speaker.
I said that, and I am delighted. I'm not sure if because I was still taking her program, that she said yes or not. And we do a lot of recommendations. A lot of our members do take her program. So delighted. So I'm just mindful of time. We have a couple more questions.
Sure. Far away.
I think we've got one, so my apologies if we don't get to all your questions, but they're all good. From Mackie, how do you handle it on a board that has that's a little clique, so it becomes very intimidating? So it's very cliquey in the boardroom, and you're sort of the outsider. How do you handle situations like that?
Good question. I think you need to be comfortable in being alone for a while until you find your way to make your own friends. I think just anytime you're coming into a board new, it's going to feel that way, I do believe, because of the longstanding relationships within. Now, I'm getting the sense there from Mackie that maybe cliquey is a negative piece, that there's maybe it's a divided board in some way. If that were the case, if it were me, I would be wanting to do my prep, come to the meeting, do my job, ask the questions, and find your way to engage in through the power of questions, and perhaps even those offline conversations with either your committee chair or your board chair, depending on what is most relevant, to try and explore that a little bit. If the chair is part of the issue, that's a different conversation. What do you think, Deborah?
Yeah, well, the next question in the queue was, is it best to resign if the chair is the issue?
Yeah, that's especially if the chair has a lot of runway left, or is a founding chair, or those types of issues. My mentor, like Brian Hayward's book, The Great Chair, came from this quote. Back in 2007, when I did my ICD.D and got certified, Dr. Jim Gillies, who is the dean of the Schulich Business School, retired at that point, was assigned as my mentor. And we went for lunch, flew back out to Toronto. We spent some time, great experience. Toward the end of our conversation, I said to him, "Sir, I'm just brand new at this. How do I find a good board?" And he said, "Find a good chair." And, full stop. And this is a veteran of 55 corporate boards, and it's like, find a good chair. And I mentioned that to Brian, that became the name of his book, but it's that important. And if you're not comfortable with the chair's leadership, your own integrity and how happy you're going to be there is something to consider. Your own values, and are you going to do your best work here, or is your time is valuable, and people want your time and they want your expertise. And if it's not appreciated where that situation is, and maybe it's time to find a new opportunity.
So Scott, we've got some really good questions, and I would hate to not get to them. So if everyone can indulge for 5 more minutes, promise we'll be finished by 1:05 at the latest. If you have to jump off, thank you for joining us. There'll be a survey and a thank you follow-up, and Scott's guide will be in there. We appreciate your time, but these are great questions, Scott, and I know you would like to respond to them. So if people can just hang tight. I've got one coming in from Suzanne from Ottawa. Hello, Suzanne. Any recommendation on how to handle a situation where clearly there's been offline discussions held by some board members, but not all? Is it best to take it up to the chair? I assume so. The bigger question is, how do we decide when to engage and when not to, right? So if you feel like you're not in the know and there's these offline discussions, how do you deal with that if you're not in the clique or in the
Right.
net?
Yeah. So, it's a great point there. Like, are these offline questions critical to a decision being made? Like, is it a parking, Carvers used to talk about these parking lot conversations where the best board meetings happen in the parking lot after the meeting. That's a different issue, I think. If it's a couple of directors having their own conversation about an issue, I don't know if there's a big problem with that, especially if you're exploring your perspective and am I off base on this? What do you think, et cetera. But if it's something that's, I think, influencing a final decision or overly influencing the perspective of the CEO or bringing things in, then my first step would be to go, if you're comfortable in your relationship with the chair, is that have a phone call afterward or before to find out, I'm not comfortable with this. And that's governance courage, folks. It's like, it doesn't have to be at the board meeting. Deborah, you made that point earlier. It could be in that offline conversation, and find out if your discomfort is warranted, would be my initial thought. But I don't know if that's a great answer, but it's certainly a great question.
No, and I think that was the advice, was to go to the chair and say, hey, here's what's happening. Here's how I'm feeling. That would be my advice. So we've got one question coming in from your friend Brian Brown. A tough situation I have to deal with is a CEO who answers a board member's question, but in reality, he never answered the question. Any advice?
Yeah, you just got to go back and say, okay, thank you. Now I'm just going to, can you help me clarify? Or that's one you might want to frame a little bit of that. I didn't quite get the point, and try and get them back on topic. And if you really need to, without, as we said earlier, being too vague is a problem, to say, you didn't answer my question. Could you please answer the question?
Right.
Like you have to ask.
So I'm mindful of time. Thank you, Scott, for your insight, for your passion. We've learned so much on, stepping up to be courageous, to be a courageous board member. So thank you for your conversations. Women Get on Board will be donating to our charity partner, Dress for Success, Toronto chapter, for your time. And thank you to Director Prep for being our sponsor for today's Women Get on Board Speaker Series. Our next Women Get on Board Speaker Series is June 16th, and the topic is Trends in Executive Compensation and Governance, and What Should Boards Be Thinking? This will be sponsored by Southleaf Group. And as we've mentioned, following the session, you will receive a link to that event for June 16th. And also, if you haven't signed up for a summit, there'll be the link to that summit. And Scott, I believe you have some of your members of Director Prep that have joined our Women Get on Board Speaker Series. And I know we've got a discount code for any of those for the speaker series, for the summit. So maybe they can take that up with you. And also, please do fill out your feedback survey. We'd love to hear from you. In the next few days, we'll have a recording that'll get populated in the next few days. And then more importantly, we just want you to, we hope to see you at our summit. And thank you. Stay safe all and be well.
Thank you.